Hello and welcome to today's seminar. Thank you for coming. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today we'll be hearing from Ray Lovett as he presents on good engagement practices for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks, Sonia, and thanks for coming. I know this seminar was a bit late notice. I think we only put out the notice last week, so it's good to have a decent turn up. I too would like to start by acknowledging country and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as well. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues in the room. So apparently we make up about half the room, so top 3 rows. Thanks for coming and filling the numbers. I wanted to give you a sort of bit of background about why this seminar came about. And really it came about in response to a request from the head of NSEF around, so Robin Lucas, around providing advice to the school, the research school of population health much broader, around how others within the school could be involved in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. Now we do get a lot of requests to provide assistance to different groups across NSEF, but also the school more broadly. And we also get a lot of requests, many more requests I actually have to say, at the university level as well. So it's not just within NSEF or RSPH, it's the university. There's quite a lot of change going on in Indigenous research at the university as well. So our group is quite heavily involved at lots of different levels in the university around the different sort of priority setting, agenda setting, major changes within the university. So for people not familiar, there's the National Centre for Indigenous Studies, and they're just going through some big changes as well. And CAPA has also just appointed a new Indigenous director for the first time, which is great news in its 25-year history. It has its first Indigenous director. So there's lots of other sort of broader things going on in the university as well. So we thought, given there was a vacant spot, what could we do to give those wanting to think about this space some guidance. But I also think it's important that we also allude to some important considerations that people need to think about in the process as well. So I hope today provides some useful guidance, and that for those thinking of doing Indigenous research, that it provides some clues for you going forward. The slides from today, we'll make them publicly available as a resource for everyone as well, so you don't have to make too many notes. And there's quite a lot of slides, actually, I hope I get through them all. Where we've got references to source documents, such as guidelines and the research priority documents, we'll include the links to those in the slides as well, so that you can just click on them to use those. One of the other reasons for the seminar, and I wanted to highlight with people as well, is the strategic planning process that the school's currently undertaking. And I have to admit, can someone mute? If you're on Zoom, can you mute yourself, please? We're getting a bit of feedback. I'd like to welcome the 4 people on Zoom as well. When I was sitting there the other day, was it the Finkel Lecture Theatre where we did that? I actually became quite concerned, if I'm really honest with you, because it looked like across our education and research priorities, the mention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research and education was mentioned in both sort of priority setting spaces. But other than mentioning the terms, there was nothing else. And so that always throws up red flags for me, because it kind of moves us away from the existing kind of priorities and settings that have been well established in this space. So I'm going to talk about some of those today, so it's fine, I think, for RSPH and NSEF to embark on priority setting in this space for research and education, but there is already really good guidance about what we should be doing, and we need to look to those resources for this stuff. And also looking at our strengths within the school already. So I just wanted to be upfront about that as well. I guess the other thing from that, the strategic planning, it didn't really acknowledge to me the huge amount of work that's already been going on in the university as well. So I'm going to talk about some of that as well, and I'll talk about particularly the Grand Challenge process, which is actually so the one that's dedicated to Indigenous health and wellbeing research this year, actually come from a priority setting process that occurred 2 years ago at the university. So I wanted to mention that as well. So today I'll just talk the broad outline for today's talk. So I'll talk about the program that I lead here at NSEF, because we get out quite a lot, but we don't. How we get out is actually outside the university. We actually and at different levels within the university. We probably don't engage as much as we would like to or could within the school, because most of our engagement is with communities outside the university. And I'll talk about why that's important. I'll talk about who are we talking about in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research, probably stuff that some of you may know but some don't know, why this is a priority. I'll talk about what are the policy priorities. So I'll talk about policy and research priorities here, because they're both very important to the work that we do, but we think that policy, we belong to the EPP group. So for us, research policy engagement is a big priority. I'll give you an example of how we do some of our engagement, and fortunately, so for most of you, we printed out a few of these. These are hot off the press. They're not even shiny yet, but they will be soon. And this is a part of how we do our research impact. We produce these little policy briefs or summary reports from our work that we do in the program. And so we've printed off about 60 copies of these, just so that you can take them away to see how we do community engagement in particular. And this is how we've done, there's just examples in there of how we've done community engagement with the Mayi study. Then I'll just showcase some of the useful guides that you can look to in terms of engagement and priorities. And there's also some ANU internal structures as well, so not just our program. There's a whole range of different levels in the university. So about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health program. So we're an Aboriginal-led, Aboriginal majority research group within NSEF. And all of our work is what we call community engaged, large-scale epidemiological and mixed method research. And it's really around informing policy and practice. So we're finding more and more in our work what we think is existing evidence to guide policy is just not there. And so very simple things for us we're finding just don't exist. All of our different research or pieces of research that we conduct in the program are all done in partnership with communities, whether that's organisations, service providers, different groups like that, and based on community identified priorities. So you'll get a taste of what those things are a bit later. One of the things we're really sticklers for, I guess, in our group is focusing our work on promoting health rather than risk factors, burden of disease. We recognise that stuff is really important, but there's a reason, and I have added in a couple of slides about why we do the work the way we do. So we call this strengths-based approach, and that's around working or highlighting what works rather than what's wrong. Because everyone knows what's wrong in Indigenous health. We hear it constantly. What we don't hear is actually what's improving, and there's actually quite a lot. Within the program, these are the different pieces of research, or different groups of research. They vary in size. So Mayi, which is the National Study of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Wellbeing, it's a large-scale cohort study. It's been in development for the last 4 years. I'm the study director of that, and it's the largest focus within our research group. At the moment, we're recruiting. We're approaching 8,500 participants. So already it's the largest study of its type in the country. If you think about NATSIS or the Australian Health Survey, so we're just surpassing those numbers, which is nice. We've done that in about 3.5 months of recruitment. The Family and Community Safety Study, our FACT study, it's another cohort study that it's examining factors that contribute to reduced violence in communities, so physical, emotional and sexual violence. That study is just winding up later this year. It's a contracted piece of work. So it aims to provide national level evidence for the first time on the extent of violence, but also what works at reducing violence in communities. Tackling Indigenous smoking, which is another program of work that we're just about to start doing. And that's looking at the impact of a national Indigenous tobacco program on reducing and preventing tobacco use. So that program of work will run the next 4 years. That's another piece of contracted research with the Department of Health. And the program itself runs across about 50% of the country. So it's quite a large program. We're just appointing a study leader there. So our study leader for family and community safety is Professor Vicky Hovain. She's based in WA, but her team are based here as well. CVD, so Jason heads up the work on cardiovascular disease here, and that's about how we take an absolute risk approach to prevention and management of CVD events, or preventing CVD events. So that's focused very much at the primary healthcare level. Again, it's a national piece of work, so you'll notice all of these are national level. And of course, my favourite, or one of my favourites, probably because it's unfunded, is Indigenous data sovereignty. And across a lot of these programs, there's this kind of theme of Indigenous data sovereignty. For those that don't know what it means, it's about how do we, what data needs and requirements are there for Indigenous communities and people to make their own decisions. So that's across all of our programs and how I think about our work. So we don't do too much. We don't do the big issues. We do. So if you think, there's about 35 or 38 of us in our group now, up from 2 of us when I started 3 years ago. So we've experienced rapid growth. And that rapid growth has occurred primarily because there's a lot to do, and there's always more to do, but we have to be very careful about what we do. So you'll see there, those are the big things, like if you take the CVD, smoking, they are the biggest contributors to the gap in terms of outcomes. If you look at Mayi, that's looking at a fundamental issue about what we don't know. I'll talk about that. And family violence receives a lot of attention, but there's very little information about that. So it's either groundbreaking work or work that is of national significance and has the potential for huge impacts. For those in the room that don't know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the first Australians. The Australia, as we know it now, was colonised in 1788. If you'd have to be pretty silly to not hear the debates that are currently going on around that particular day. So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of media attention about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's place in Australia at the moment. I think that's a good conversation. We shouldn't hide from that sort of stuff, and it's good to have those kinds of conversations. So the population around colonisation was estimated at between 300,000 to 700,000. Some estimates are up to 1 million, and some 300 to 400 different languages were spoken at the time. Of course, there are lots of negative impacts of colonisation, but also the subsequent policies that were implemented, not just from that time as well. So I'm not sure, who's heard of frontier wars in Australia? Okay, so that's probably less than half of you. So we should know about these things. Has anyone, I put this in just to, for shock value. But is it going to work? Oh, God. That's right. So did anyone know that we have a map of where massacres occurred in Australia? It's going to work. So you can see all those yellow dots. Western Australia hasn't been mapped yet, but you can see all those yellow dots that indicate massacre sites. And you'll notice it's primarily eastern, because of course that's where colonisation occurred first. And you'll see a proliferation, particularly eastern New South Wales, southern Victoria and Tasmania. So of course they're the areas mostly affected in the early days first. But I think the last recorded massacre, wasn't too long ago either. So I just wanted to highlight that these resources are available to understand our history a little bit better. Of course, then we've got the White Australia policy, missions and reserves. So people might know about missions and reserves. So often what happened, so the massacres were due to the expansion of pastoralists and free settlers. So after they were released from their jailers, they were given land grants, and often those land grants were in conflict with Aboriginal people living on the land at the time, so it was primarily driven over land. And of course then successive governments decided to relocate Aboriginal people onto specific plots of lands which were either run by missionaries, so missions, or reserves, so government managed reserves. So my family come from a particular reserve in Western New South Wales where lots of people were moved. We were moved 3 times to accommodate pastoralists. And in Mayi Kuwayu, we're actually collecting data on where people were moved as part of our history. And in the data, if we go back 3 generations, just 3 generations in that data, so people living today, about 30% of people are identified that they were relocated or their ancestors were relocated. Then if we also ask people about stolen generations, so people have heard of stolen generations where children were removed for being half-caste or being lighter skinned to integrate into society. Again, up to about 30% of the population was removed under those policies. So if we're talking about 60 to 70% of the entire population were directly affected by these policies. And that doesn't disappear. So some of these policies were running until the 1970s, not 1870s. The effects of some of those policies still exist today. Of course, a lot of those policies were based on historical racism or notions of racism around intellect, so intellectual capacity. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of this stuff being replicated, being told to us by Aboriginal people in Mayi Kuwayu. So that's the most common stereotype that people are reporting to us, is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not as smart as other people. So we're seeing this in our data now. So we have some cool measures around exposure to racism, because no one else will collect the information, the ABS and other organisations. Hope the ABS is not on Zoom, but anyway. So our history and why we bang on about it a lot is because it is important to us. It shows you why the situation currently is as it is. We can't really escape that. And we probably shouldn't. So I just wanted to put up the map of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia just to show the diversity of different groups. I've done this before. So removing the state and territory boundaries, you can see that we're a very diverse population. It That's not really reflected in our statistics, so often we're aggregated quite a lot. And because of issues around identification and other data practices, it's quite common for all of us to be presented in aggregate form. Our wish is really, in our program, is to disaggregate. I'd love to know how many Nyampa people there are, my family. We have no idea about that. We don't know how many Noongar people there are from Western Australia. We don't know how many Aranda people there are from Central Australia. It'd be great to have those stats available for us. Often when we meet each other, if we haven't met before, we ask about who's your mob. So mob is tribal affiliation. Gabrielle, you asked this question at my PhD final seminar. What is this concept of mob? So it is just which language group, which tribal group you're affiliated with. So I often get confused for a different tribal group, which is Gunditj Murra, because of my last name. So there's some famous Lovets that play AFL, and they're all Gunditj Murra from southern Victoria. I'm related to them, but we're matrilineal. So Lovets are my father's side, and Johnsons and Kennedys are my mother's side, but that's how we follow our matrilineal line. So, which is Western New South Wales. Some people might be looking confused now because they're going, hang on a minute, his mother and father are Aboriginal. But, not the stereotypical view of an Aboriginal person. Often we find that stereotypical view is reserved for North Australia, but I can tell you where most of us live is where everyone else wants to live. So the eastern states, the coastal regions, because they're nice places to live, right? But in saying that, there's still a lot of Aboriginal people that live in more remote areas as a proportion of the population. So more Aboriginal people live in the Northern Territory and in very remote areas as well. But often, people feel that urban Aboriginal people get sort of forgotten about. And particularly when we're talking about health equity, a lot of the issues are actually the same as in remote and very remote areas. It's just hidden a lot better because we're much more a minority. So the local population here in the ACT and Queanbeyan, for example, is up around 6,000 people, but you wouldn't really know that. So this just makes my point a little bit further, that the population distribution, while not at the same levels as the non-Indigenous population in urban and regional areas, is still majority, but there's a much larger majority in remote and very remote areas. It's interesting though that this same notion that has occurred in Australia over history is also occurring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So between the censuses, we're seeing more and more Aboriginal people move to urban areas. Probably got something to do with opportunities, the same reasons other people move. We also have a much younger population as well, so we probably know this as well. So I think it's about 53% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are under the age of 25 years, which is quite different to the non-Indigenous population. And not as many in the older age groups, but we'll know why soon. So I'll get into the policy priorities. So the big one that most have probably heard about at the federal level is the close the gap policy, or closing the gap policy, depending on who you talk to. So I have huge issues with this policy, I have to say, in the work that I do. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. I mean, the intent of the policy is good. It talks about shared decision-making in the work that we do, place-based responses and regional decision-making for policy, evidence evaluation and accountability, so that it talks about all this sort of stuff. I wonder about the accountability. Targeted investment and integrated systems. So it talks about things the right way. Unfortunately, when it comes to some of the stats that are kind of put out, and the Prime Minister's statement on closing the gap every year as the first order of business in Parliament is an important one. So I take quite a different spin on the data. So this is from the most recent analysis around child mortality rates, which showed that between 1998 and 2017, Indigenous child mortality rates declined significantly by around 35%. So the Close the Gap conclusion in their report, though, was that. I'll ask a question. Why do we think they say that? Bit of audience participation required here. Jason, I can see you want to say something.
Well, it's just framing the achievement around dominant culture around non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, that's because we talked about this, right?
That's why I get to work with you, yeah, but like a 30% drop in mortality is incredible. And I don't know if you plot the smoking statistics as well. But
of course.
Yeah, but like if we just think about what has happened to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health over the past 20 years, it is effing phenomenal. You know what I mean? But everyone frames it around this gap. And it hides that achievement of Aboriginal people and policymakers as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a fine line too that we talk about. So I've taken a particular section of the report, which is further down. The first lines talk about there has been no significant decline since the Close the Gap policy was implemented in 2008, right? Whereas I've taken the data, it's a more historical kind of lens where you're looking at trends over time. But also the notion that the target is to halve the gap in child mortality by 2018. Like, how was that determined? How was that target determined? And that's one of the things that's being revisited in the current refresh, because they didn't model it. They didn't produce or do some estimates or anything like that. I mean, it's nice to be aspirational, but it's also good to be realistic as well. And so in this space, often because issues are urgent and pressing, people go, we have to do things and we have to do big things and we have to do them fast. But I'm a fan of slow research. I've talked about this before. And that we need to take considered approaches. If we I've only taken male life expectancy here, so we take another example from the Closing the Gap report. So the annual increase in life expectancy for Indigenous males, and I can say for Indigenous females, they always do better than the men. So they're improving life expectancy quicker than Indigenous males. So you can see that there's a half a year improvement between 2010 and 2012. There's a reason why they use 3-year data. And in more recent times, a 0.3-year improvement. The more recent improvement is better than the previous improvement. But it still talks about improvement, right? But the conclusion again, so the target to close the gap in life expectancy by 2031 is not on track. So we see this same conversation. While we're seeing improvement, we're still classified as failing. Now I have to say that most of that failure and the conversation that goes on about failure falls on our shoulders. The accountability that I mentioned from the policy narrative is really good, but often the accountability and the conversation goes on in the media that every year the Prime Minister stands up and we're not achieving things. One, it's because the way we talk about it. So we're seeing these conversations at the bottom of the screen. And so that sort of follows on then to where we keep throwing money at Indigenous affairs and nothing changes. So there's this natural progression from failure to we need to divest. So some of that goes on as well. And we saw that in 2014 in the federal budget. There was a $500 million divestment from Indigenous affairs under Tony Abbott. As a result of this continued talk of failure, when there have been some very significant successes. I've only mentioned 2 here, but things like CVD mortality have declined by 48% since 1998. And Jason mentioned smoking. So for the first time in the last decade, we're seeing cessation and the non-uptake of smoking in the Indigenous population occur faster in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population than the non-Indigenous population. Before that, that wasn't happening. So there are successes. Again, so sort of highlighting this disparity versus progress frame. So it's not just using statistics to tell a story, it actually has an impact on what people do. So if you tell Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we're failing to close the gap, then people are less likely to do things. They're less likely to listen to health promotion messages. They're less likely to change behavioural lifestyle things. So that's really important. And there's international research on this as well, that when we use a progress frame, we elicit more positive emotional responses and it encourages health promoting behaviours. So how we talk about this stuff is very, very important as well. And I'm not saying this to hide the fact that there are issues and that we need to do, that we do need health equity, which we do. That's very different from closing a gap, which is the space between two lines, right? So the conversation that we currently see is on the graph on the left. It is actually the space, white space, between the top and the bottom line. When we talk about smoking, so this is from an analysis Katie Thurber and Alison, who I think might be online, did a couple of years ago. It's the same line, right? The blue line. We just look at the blue line. There's been that drop, 35,000 fewer smokers. 2/3 of those people would have died from their smoking habit. 23,000 lives saved. It's real, means something to people, and people like hearing that message a lot better than we're not achieving things. So if we take the data from the left, it looks like the relative rate is increasing for smoking. So again, it tells you a different story. So we talk a lot about trends over time, but an important thing that I tend to focus on, particularly in my Kuwayu, is that about 50% of the gap in health inequity is currently unexplained. So that's another thing that people don't commonly understand. It's about 50% of this inequity we don't have any data that we can use to explain that. So there's a really good report done in 2005 by some people at CAPA that shows that. I really want to do an update to that to see if we've got better data now. I think it's also important to know that the evidence tells us that even when we compare like with like in terms of education, income and employment, health outcomes are still different. So if there was another 42-year-old non-Indigenous male, same BMI, same education level, all those kind of factors standing right next to me, there's a good chance my life expectancy would still be reduced. So again, we don't understand that. We don't understand why. I think we have some clues to that. But that's a really important issue for us as well. Oh, right, yeah, green. Green means good. Okay. So our national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policies, so we have this one, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan, which explains why we do the work we do around Mayi. So it places Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture at the centre. The interesting thing is when you do a Control F on this document, culture is mentioned twice. The first time is in the centre of this picture. The second time is the paragraph after it, which talks about why culture is important to deal with, but it doesn't actually explain what it is. And it doesn't explain how they're going to operationalise this. So Mayi, our national cohort study, goes directly towards this. So we spend a lot of time talking with people about what culture is and how it helps health and wellbeing. I'm really sorry. I know ACT's showed up, but did we have the ACT one on there? Is there a current one? Sorry to put you on the spot, Alicia. It's in development there. Okay, I don't feel so bad now that it's not on there. So you can see, depending on which jurisdiction you're working in, that there are state and territory plans, or they're in development. I've been involved in a couple of the ACT ones as well. So if you're looking for policy priorities, moving particular to your area of expertise and want to become involved, I'd be looking to those. You'll notice on the bottom of these slides that, as well as including the ANU logo, I include the Lowitja Institute logo. So the Lowitja Institute is very important to our program because they are what's known as the old Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health CRC. So it's been around for over 20 years, and we have quite a heavy engagement with this organisation, and we're involved heavily also in their priority setting for research. So I thought I'd just give you an overview of where their research priorities sit at the moment, and you'll see some of our work sits within these priorities. So of course the first one, which is the cultural and social determinants, family and community health, health services and workforce, health policy and systems, science and health conditions, and some international work. Now you'll see a lot of these policy documents are quite broad, but they are more specific if you go into the documents and look at the kinds of programs that sit under them. So I can tell you that under the cultural and social determinants, this organisation lists Kuwayu, our study, as one of its largest programs of work. So next week, about 5 of us, I think, from the program are attending the Lowitja Institute conference in Darwin, and we're presenting on the range of work that we do across the program, and particularly around the cultural determinants of wellbeing. So again, just highlighting our external engagement outside the university, but trying to bring Indigenous governance structures like this into ANU is quite important. And the Lowitja Institute has a pretty interesting way of working. So it works across these 5 key principles that I guess in our program we follow as well. So the first one is around beneficence, and that we have to act for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the conduct of our research. So you'll see most of our research, we don't do it unless it has some benefit for people. Leadership by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the research. Engagement of research end users. Development of the research workforce is a big priority. I came through that system. I think a couple of our students have won scholarship awards or been scholars from the Lowitja Institute as well, so they're very big into development and measuring the impact of research. So of all our research contracts, poor Lockie and Jan, who have to report on these have the heaviest reporting burden in our whole program. Because these guys really want to know how our work is making a difference. It does take a lot of work. Then we also have the NHMRC. I'm not showing the ARC research priorities. So Roadmap 3 is the research sort of policy document for priorities. And you can see here that their priorities, so the first is around research that is focused on the health system, social and cultural determinants. You can see we kind of got into every kind of guideline development process or priority setting with cultural determinants. Research areas where there's a significant burden of disease or the highest differential quality of life for Aboriginal people, so they take a more broader view, and research on specific diseases that are almost exclusive to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So you can see under those sorts of things, there's quite a lot of infectious diseases, Martin, listed under there. The third thing I wanted to, is it third, fourth? I don't know. ANU priorities. So most people I highlighted the Grand Challenge, but they actually come from a process that started in 2016. So Emily Banks, Katie and I were involved in setting up this process. And we held some stakeholder consultations in 2017. So unfortunately, this has morphed into the 2019 Grand Challenge. I say unfortunately because we now have to go through a bidding process when perhaps we should just fund the priorities, right? So however we can do it. So addressing racism, including in the health system, social and emotional wellbeing. If anyone here, I'm sure you've all read the guidelines for the Grand Challenge. These are the priorities in the Grand Challenge. I'm particularly interested in number 5. So you can see right at the national level through to our research institutions, through to ANU, how all of those different priorities are set out. It's quite clear. So now moving into the community engagement study. So I'm going to talk about the case study of Mayi Kuwayu, which is, as I've mentioned, is our national cohort study. The focus in it is culture and wellbeing, culture and health. It has a multi-mode recruitment. We had a pilot postal survey in 2018 to 20,000. We had a further mail or postal survey in February of 180,000. So you can imagine that's quite a big deal, costs quite a lot of money. But we're also continuing in community recruitment as well for the rest of the year. We have an online phone survey option and communication. So Lucy, who was taking all the photos, was really good on our comms side of things. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter. And so we're hoping by the end of this year that we'll have around 15 to 16,000 participants in this study. So, this is the usual kind of process set up for a cohort study, right, that we might conduct here at NSEF or at RSPH, but the whole study operates around this community-based participatory research process that we use for almost all of our research in the program. It's often described as best practice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research, and you'll see in the little booklet, this is all there for you to read, that at the centre of that are our relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And you'll note that even though we're an Indigenous unit, we are still bound by all of these things as well. So we also have to have good engagement processes and practices and structures. It's not just saying that you as non-Indigenous researchers have to do these things as well. If we're saying it, we have to apply it to ourselves as well, and we do. So the relationships are the most important thing to us. Community decision-making around engagement in research is extremely important. Our communications, capacity development of us as researchers, which is often, we think it's about community capacity development, but it's also about ours. And also a big feature of our work is around data governance and applying Indigenous data sovereignty. Some of our relationships in Mayi Kuwayu have been really long-standing, so up to 5 years. So for the first 2.5 years of this study, it wasn't even funded. But our relationships have been going since then, so particularly in Central Australia, where we were doing some of our earlier work. And even at the end of 2019, so they're engaged in recruitment for us, our relationships won't end then. It'll continue, hopefully for a long time into the future. And that just seems to be the way we work. I mean, it should be the way we work. I was going to give you an example, but the case study's in the guide as well, and I'm probably running out of time, just about how we do this stuff. And it's not about us deciding what is a priority for a community. We might approach through our existing networks to say, we've got this project, how can it help you? While at the same time help, say, Mayi Kuwayu in terms of our national study. So in one of the communities we're working with, they want to use our survey and our information for a whole of population census. And they want us to provide that data. They want to add questions to it for their local area, those sorts of things, so we have to do that. And we have to provide the data back to them in a form that is suitable for them to use every year. So the rest of our cohort study is every 2 years we follow up, but for these guys, they want it every year because they want to monitor progress over time. So that's just an example. One of the other things that we do with these communities is statistical capacity building. So we go up for a couple of days, run an intensive with local Aboriginal health workers and other Aboriginal people working in these organisations around knowing how to do your own stats and then how to manipulate data to show what's going on in your community. So we do things like that. So again, much more external engagement. So a big part of our work in Mayi is around Indigenous data sovereignty, and for those that don't know, this one slide, I hope, offers some guidance around what that is. So yes, it is around governance of data, but that's really important because it's about who controls information. So for us, it's about us controlling the data story and how we should be known rather than the closing the gap approach, where we have no control. And with that, we can tell a different story. So a story of achievement or improving outcomes. But then we also need data for governance. So how do we make our own decisions? So that's around designing, delivering our own programs, plus evaluating programs as well. So we need information to do these things. Are the programs that are being implemented in communities, are they working? It's also around developing our own technical and human resource capabilities as well. So the Mayi is a great one. That's why we're heavily invested in the Mayi and having Mayis within our unit, but also doing the statistical capacity stuff out in communities as well. So Mayi, we have a big program of work over the next 3 years around validating the measures we've built in that process. And that's really to make sure, so the first question we get around, when we know we get this around our racism questions, how do you know they're valid? Because, the questioning of what we're doing always comes first. So given my PhD was half psychometrics and half epidemiology, we place a heavy emphasis on making sure our measures are good, because then we can go back to people and say they are good, and this is real, which is what people are questioning. So in the data resource that we'll have from Mayi, hopefully at the end of this year, we've formed an external, all Indigenous data governance committee that sits over and controls the data. I have no say in this, and I'm the study director. But we've deliberately, again, applying our own principles to our own work. So this is not funded in research. But we have to do this because communities and people expect that Aboriginal people will be in control of this process. So the committee's already met twice. We don't even have any data, but they're thinking about, well, how do people apply for these data? So they're thinking about individual researchers, students, policymakers, any other people that may want access to these data. So this is kind of where we've got to. And it's important to note that the committee wants right of veto. So sort of ultimate control. I know this goes against lots of kind of principles in research, but where the committee has informed itself about how it wants to operate. So that's our data governance, our study governance as well. So these guys have been in place since 2014. So they've guided our project development over that time. They're guiding the project rollout, and they guide and prioritise our research, evaluation and knowledge exchange program in the study itself as well. So there's 24 people that belong to this group, majority Aboriginal again, but they come from all of these different peak Indigenous organisations across the country. So we have quite a lot of representation. Again, this side of our research is not funded. So our current status, we run, I mentioned our communications side of things. We run an ambassadors program. The Deadly Ninja is in town at the moment. He's one of our ambassadors. Anyone watch that? Ninja Warrior? Never heard of that? Different crowd. It's appealing to the younger people, I don't know. I hadn't watched it either, don't worry. So I mentioned we've got about we're approaching 8,500 responses, and we're very community engaged, I have to say, and it's a part of the job that I love. Like when I'm not here, it's really great. So that picture with Katie and I, that's actually on Thursday Island in the Torres Strait, where on the right-hand side they were running a health clinic, a healthy community day. We were there with our tent. We have a couple of these tents, and we just travel around everywhere. The Deadly Ninja is the guy on the right. Elsie Seriat, who is one of our community ambassadors who lives on Thursday Island, and Katie and I. So we went up there, and then the next day we sponsored their half marathon, and Katie and I ran the marathon, a half marathon. Katie won the women's half marathon. I came third. So we do things like that as well. So we partner with community, really positive events like that, engage community that way. There's also some really good guides that you can use from Research World as well. So I was involved in reviewing a lot of these documents as well around ethical processes in the research journey. So keeping research on track too. This one's a bit heavy, I reckon. These are kind of the, so you'll see this if you apply for an NHMRC grant, you'll have to address these criteria in your application. And some people really struggle with that. But again, we probably have some good guidance here at the ANU around how you could address these things. And I've hopefully given you some examples of those things. The AATSIS guidelines as well, so the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies also has a number of principles that you have to address. So for national research, we always go here first. So there's a big list of their principles that you have to address. And this is one I find that's quite useful as well. So there's that. We'll make all these available, and I know I'm running out of time. Also, if you're supervising Indigenous students here as well, there's guides around supporting students. And then there's the ANU internal structures. So I mentioned the National Centre for Indigenous Studies. So it does have a central place where you can go to ask about who you should engage with or what networks are available through NCIS. But the really lesser known structure that we have is that CHM. So it's new. I'm sure the new dean doesn't even know about it because Jane Dahlstrom set it up. And they have an Indigenous research reference group. So late last year we went through a process of setting up some forms that people could fill out to get advice about what they needed to do for their research. So we were involved in helping set up that process, and as a result of today I'll go back to them and say, where is that at? Because I've done a bit of searching before today to try and find that contact point. It's not there. So that's internally. And I hope that's given you some guidance. That's nearly an hour. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. Do we have about 2 questions for Ray, please?
Thanks, Ray.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that occurred to me right at the beginning of your presentation was a remark that Maggie Broden made years ago.
Mm-hmm.
She did a lot of work in Indigenous communities, which was about the fact that there was always this kind of setting up of new interventions or pilot studies, and they'd show that they were successful, and then the money would run out, and then the wheel would be reinvented over and over again. And one of the things that made me wonder was whether that was because none of the studies that were done were ever that kind of large scale, and whether you doing a large scale study might be a way of actually overcoming that kind of cycle.
Yep. So we've been very deliberate in Kuwayu, and that is one of the reasons. So we did a review of, because you do that as a part of your setup of your study, a review of the evidence around sort of culture and well-being. And, one of the critiques that we made of the 72 studies we found in the last 20 years around the relationship was that they're all highly localised, very, often small scale. Well, in fact, all of them are small scale. And so that definitely feeds into that notion. So we've taken a very deliberate approach to go to, what are we up to now, 14 or 15 ethics committees nationally, because all of these structures, are barriers to make sure that it is national, that it's large scale. And a lot of the work that we did in development showed that while we are highly diverse, like the map says, some of the cultural constructs are universal. And so that tells us that we can ask the same questions similar ways across the diversity of the population. But yeah, more broadly to the power of the data. Yeah, is very much part of that. But I'm sure the shifting landscape of policy making it's got a lot to answer for in this space as well. You know, so everything that's old is new again sometimes. Even, like, I'll give you just a very simple example of when we were applying to do the postal survey. So it was a particular area in a government agency that we had to go to seek permission to even mail out to people listed in Medicare. So in the guide, it said it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get permission. It took us 1 year and 1 week. And I had to negotiate that with 6 different people over that period of time. So the churn, and I know this happens a lot in policy agencies for everyone. So vigilance, you know, you have to be really persistent. Yeah, I'm sure everyone's nodding, so yeah. Yeah, so just simple things like that, right through to big things about, well, we know that these programs work, you know, I remember it from 20 years ago, where is that now? Yeah, but often it is discounted. We've done some work more recently in another very remote community, and it's just been really hard because of the small numbers, yeah, to say, you know, yeah.
Is there another final question from someone?
Just a comment, Ray, the research advisory committee for the college did meet a couple of times last year, and it has fallen off the radar of Russell. I've reminded him of it.
Are you on that, eh?
I'm on it as the research committee chair representative.
Okay. Yep.
But it really does need quite a bit of support, and Janine Mohammed, who was
She's moved on. Yep.
moved on, and
She's now the CEO of the Lowacha Institute, by the way. Yep.
well, you know, she's fantastic. So,
Yep.
but I think it'd be great if you could, because I actually think it's really important to have good engagement at the college level as well, and in senior leadership throughout the, you know, this college and also the university. So it'd be great if you wanted to raise that with Russell.
I will, don't worry. Yep.
I already have, but I think,
Yep.
you know, unless people say stuff, it just doesn't get heard, and, you know, it's not like a broken record.
Yep. And one point I would probably like to conclude on. So the Grand Challenge stuff, you know, it's all raging at the moment. The interesting thing I have to say, so I expected to get huge numbers of emails, phone calls. I expected to be inundated, right? I have not received one single email or phone call from anyone in this university about the Grand Challenges, which I find fascinating.
We think you're too busy.
Well, I am too busy, right? But if you look at those priorities, and I also have a research agenda, okay, right? You know, so, you know, even people putting up their ideas. So I'm worried, you know, I'm worried people are fearful of approaching us. So I've heard this as well, that, you know, that we're going to react in a certain way to people, which I hate to think that I've not engaged, or our area hasn't engaged, you know, to scare people away. But, you know, I respect that people know and understand that we're very busy, but at the same time, you know, some of those priorities are directly aligned with our program of work. And so, of course, it makes sense for us to think about what we should do. But also, you know, more broadly, if people are interested in some of those priorities, like, don't be scared of putting forward your ideas, even to the process. Yeah, I think, you know, it's a really good opportunity, and people should, you know, take that opportunity. But you have to do it the right way. And that's all we're saying. Don't be fearful of the process. Yeah. All right.
Well, please help me in thanking Ray again for Next week, the seminar will be on statistical significance. Thank you. Very engaging speech.
unusual here?
No, I just really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you.
Well, there's just so much. I had to rush through a few things. I could just see the time sort of slipping away. But yeah, maybe do one twice a year instead of once a year. Might be a bit better. Oh, the Zoom people are going.
I can turn this off.